we're going to be talking about victims' rights and services broadly, but focus a lot on focus mostly on how to make victims' rights and services available to people who are accessing them right now, in part by increasing awareness of victims' rights and services, and also talking about sort of structural changes that need to be made in the victim services realm. So I'm really excited to introduce our panelists, who are John Torres of Youth Live, that's Heather Warnken of the Warren Institute, Natasha Haney of Stanford Law, and Carla Project. Awesome. And Carla of Memory Center. So I thought we could start off by allowing each of you to introduce yourselves a little more context and your work.
Oh, sure. So my name is John Torres. I'm the Deputy Director with a program called Youth Alive. In Youth Alive, we work out of Oakland. We're based out of Oakland. We actually had a chapter as well in Los Angeles some years ago, but right now we're centered out of Oakland. We have 3 operational programs. Essentially, our mission is to prevent youth violence and to develop youth leaders. So one of our programs doesn't so much talk about victimization in this conversation, but it's our Teens on Target program. And essentially, we recruit every year 35 to 45 high school students to be peer educators and mentors for middle school students. We have a 6-session curriculum that they get, that they get trained upon, but a lot of it is really bringing their own individual voice, into the actual curriculum and being able to connect with youth and their peers, on that more intimate level. The other 2 programs that we have are violence intervention programs, and both do really work with programs like the Victim Compensation Program. The first is called the Crossfire. We've been operating this program since 1994, and at the core, it's essentially a hospital-based intervention program. We go into hospitals. We work primarily with Highland Hospital in Oakland, but also with Eden Medical Center and Children's Hospital, and we provide longer-term case management services. Our point of entry, or our first point of contact, is usually at bedside. So we'll go in and see clients while they're still in the hospital and start to assess kind of their needs, their strengths, and start to stabilize first the immediate incident or crisis. We work with gunshot victims primarily, but also stabbing victims and physical assaults. And when they are released, then our services kick in. On paper, it's up to 12 months. We go beyond that in many cases when folks needs kind of determine that. But one of the big things is that we do engage in connecting clients with the Victim Crime Office, our local Victim Crime Office, and start to really engage them in that whole process around the services that are offered through that. The last program that we operate is the Gaddafi Washington Project. It is named so because of the founders. She had actually lost her son due to violence, and so she started a whole organization around that. We merged with them. They came under the Youth Live umbrella in 2011 after about already 10 years of operating in Oakland. But essentially, it's similar services to Crossfire, but with homicide victims' families. And so there's a whole other angle, obviously, with victims of crime offices that that apply for individuals who've been killed and their families. And so we engage them in intense work there. It's not as long as, say, with our hospital victims, because they are survivors and we're able to build, and the point is to build relationships and actually help them, change some of their behaviors or risk factors. But with homicide families, we're looking more at navigating them through systems like funeral arrangements, working with funeral homes, and engaging on a shorter period, although we continuously contact folks up to a year, 2 years later. But it's kind of more intense as far as like the intense work that we do. And I'll pass on.
Hi everyone, my name is Heather Warnken. I'm an attorney and legal policy associate at the Warren Institute of Law and Social Policy at UC Berkeley School of Law. Just a little bit about my background and the perspective I'm bringing to this discussion. We at the Warren Institute have been engaged in research, community-engaged research, both qualitative and quantitative, trying to understand who crime victims are and what are their unmet needs, specifically in California. I'll just run through a couple of the projects that have amassed this knowledge that we're continually trying to build on and continually trying to disseminate both to policymakers and direct service providers in the field to help improve the effectiveness of victim services and how we treat victims in the context of the criminal justice system and beyond. And just a little bit about the Warren Institute also, because I think it speaks to why our projects are structured the way that they are and the type of impact that centers like that can have in these discussions. Really, the Warren Institute is focused on building bridges between research and practice. So we're not doing academic work in a vacuum, thinking about these issues esoterically. We're really getting out into communities, trying to elevate the voices of survivors of crime, direct service providers on the front line who understand these issues inside and out and really know how to inform what does and what doesn't work with our policies. So this started in 2011, kind of serendipitously how we got so into this work. Through the federal stimulus, there was an infusion of resources through the Violence Against Women Act, and that money, a lot of it went to the states to do program evaluation. And what it led to in California was the first ever statewide assessment of the role of criminal justice system-based services in responding to violence against women. And even though it was kind of narrowed to the crime types of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, it was revelatory on just what are these services all about, what does it look like when you house them within the criminal justice system, and what kind of impact are they actually having. And so this was a really big deal because these centers only came about in the late 80s after kind of the victims of crime movement got started. And what it established in the California Penal Code, and the way we do it here in California is similar to a lot of states, is that every single county in the entire state of California runs a victim services program out of the justice system that is supposed to be available to all victims, no matter whether they report crime, no matter what the crime type, and it provides, in theory, a whole host of services, everything from court support and navigating the criminal justice process to resource and referrals to a much broader spectrum of trauma recovery and health and other needs that happen in the aftermath of crime. And the existence of these services really got a boost in 2008 when, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about this as we talk about the difference between what our law and policy says versus implementation and what things actually look like in communities. But in 2008, California made history and really a name for itself as a leader in victims' rights and services when we passed via ballot measure Proposition 9, which amended the California Constitution to enumerate 17 rights for crime survivors. And here we are 6 years later, and we'll speak to this. There are many communities, many victims, many service providers who know that in their everyday interactions that Marshall's Law is still either a fiction or we at least have a very long way to go. So we did a statewide needs assessment at the Warren Institute that involved an electronic survey and follow-up interviews with every single participating program, and then site visits to 9 different counties throughout the state to be very representative of urban, rural, the different models that they choose to run these programs. Some run them out of the DA's office, some run them out of the probation department. Some contract out these government-based obligations to victims to community-based providers, and just the host of implications that has just even structurally. What we didn't account for was the fact that we were actually going to get 100% participation rate from every program in the entire state. So this was so exciting and just not normal for researcher projects like this. And I wish I could take the credit for that, although it was pretty annoyingly persistent in my follow-up with these programs. I think really what that speaks to is how relegated to the side victim services and these programs and just these issues have been. And to the point that the public at large, but even other criminal justice system stakeholders like law enforcement, like judges, like attorneys that interact with these victims' issues every day peripherally, didn't even really understand the significance of these programs. And these programs statewide, and there was an accountability among those programs. You have to step up and participate. Like, this is our chance to have what we do understood and elevated, and to weigh in on how under-resourced and underappreciated we are, within the context of this response. So that was this first report, and I'm happy to share any of these reports, any of this information with all of you. They're all electronic and on our website as well. And just skipping ahead, so we were sitting on a mountain of information on this field, and even got the attention of the Department of Justice in DC, because that, again, that unprecedented, really comprehensive perspective. You have the state of California with the diversity among the 58 counties. It's almost like a mini US when you think about, you have one set of laws and regulations and policies on the books about how we treat victims of crime that's supposed to look the same no matter where you go, but you get an in-depth response from what it looks like in economically depressed, urban, high-crime areas versus rural counties that have a complete other set of challenges with victim access and transportation, and you have other counties that are receiving an influx of other resources because they might have the availability to do that through their DA's office or otherwise, and other counties that don't appreciate what victim services are, so they're operating just on their shoestring budget from the core amount of funding. So that's just a little taste of kind of what we started to work with, and then from there, that begot other projects in this area, because we really started to appreciate that in 2014, victims' rights and services policy is still uncharted territory. I mean, it's really still amazing that we're looking at a dearth of data on who crime victims are and what are their unmet needs, and how are the state resources that are earmarked for this, how effective are they given, and again, our service providers here are going to have just so much to say on this, when we don't diversify the points of access for victims. And the current state of affairs for our public dollars on this is that over 90% of victim services programs are still based in the DA's office. And what are the implications for communities that have strained relationships with law enforcement, and when so many of our victim services policies and our 17 rights that we so proudly say are in the Constitution to protect victims, what does that look like when the rubber meets the road? And I guess I can start with that.
My name is Carla Richmond, and I'm a therapist and a licensed clinical social worker at the Trauma Recovery Center, which has also emerged in the last couple of years with Survivors International. And we work with victims of violent crime, adults who are victims of violent crime. We have a sister clinic at the hospital, at San Francisco General Hospital, that works with youth. And a couple years ago, we also merged with Survivors International, so that we also now work with global survivors of critical torture. With our victims of violent crime here in San Francisco, we have a lot of interaction with the California Victim Crime Program. And I know we're going to be talking more about that. But just to tell you a bit about the services that we offer at our clinic. So we're affiliated with UCSF and with the Department of Public Health in San Francisco, with the San Francisco General Hospital. And we actually, sort of similar to your program, John, we do first point of contact often with our clients who are survivors of violent crime is at bedside at the hospital at San Francisco General, which is the trauma unit for this one. We also, and that includes both victims of physical violence, of physical assaults, and domestic violence. It also includes survivors of sexual assault. We are the program that provides the forensic evidence collection and an acute medical and mental health support to recent victims of an acute sexual assault. And we have point of contact often within hours of the assault or within a week of the assault, and then can connect that survivor to ongoing therapy and case management support. We also receive referrals from domestic violence agencies in the city. We also get some direct referrals, including for family members who are survivors who have lost a loved one to homicide. We also have a specialization working with survivors who have a traumatic brain injury, and actually work with victims of crime and non-victims of crime who have a traumatic brain injury. And essentially, some of the things that distinguish our program is now, I think, about 14 years old, and when it started, it's two programs, in fact. There's the Rape Treatment Center, and then there's the Trauma Recovery Center. And the Rape Treatment Center, it actually predates the Trauma Recovery Center and was the city's agency for meeting the needs of rape survivors in the city. And our current executive director, when she became involved in that program, she had some concerns about the degree to which we were properly meeting the needs of rape survivors in the city. And she actually did a lot of work to bring that agency to the level where it is now. And the Trauma Recovery Center, which has been funded by grant funds at points through the Victim of Crime program, and is currently grant funded again. We work with a broader range of victims of violent crime, as I mentioned, victims of assaults and victims of homicide victims and the survivors I mentioned. And we're providing case management, especially during that acute phase in the immediate aftermath of a crime, when life is really destabilized for people, when their most basic needs like housing and health and for basic services becomes a very, very difficult task. And we're also providing trauma-based therapy, very well trained group of professionals who provide coordinated care in terms of mental health services. And I know we're going to talk more about victims of violent crime program, but we do interface very directly with them. We work with advocates for our clients who are pursuing a legal case and sit alongside them when they're testifying in the courtroom and support them through that whole process, including for our sexual assault survivors being at the emergency room when they first make a report to the police. And we also help with that process of the application, which is definitely challenging. You know, there's some advocates within that program we work alongside with, and they're really great. And then there's this, but they're working in a system that's really flawed. And I think the good advocates within that system are also very aware of that. So I'll leave it at that.
Hi, I'm Natasha Haney. I'm a 3L here at Stanford. I am with the Carla Justice Pro Bono project. I've been doing it for the past 3 years. The project was sort of founded based on the idea that there are lots of pro bono projects at Stanford to deal with defendants and treating criminal defendants fairly in the justice system. And that's obviously really important, but there were no similar programs to help victims. And the concept of parallel justice is just that both sides, so to speak, should be treated fairly within the criminal justice system. I think it would be fair to say that it's been a struggle a little bit so far, just because of what everyone's been saying. Victims are sort of an unseen, people don't really want to think about them either, because it's kind of unpleasant to think about. So just getting sympathy and getting people who want to, play an active role in dealing with this issue has been a little bit difficult. But primarily what we do is help people get money from the state victim compensation fund that people have been mentioning so far. We've been finding that by and large, not by and large, but often crime victims are denied the funds that they're entitled to for sort of incorrect reasons, but for the most part, victims aren't informed enough to go through the huge packet of regulations and figure out, what their rights actually are. So we've been helping them with that.
So my first question is for Carla and John. I feel like we can jump from this too, but the words trauma and trauma-informed care are very central to this discussion, and Heather, I'm going to be asking you about this later, but there's been a lot of research from, in surveys with victims saying that in many cases, attorneys that they're working with might not be as familiar with trauma-informed care, trauma-informed practices. So could you maybe define those terms and talk about what it means to you to be someone providing trauma-informed services?
Sure. I'll start by just talking about that word trauma very briefly. I think that in sort of, common parlance, I think trauma is something we often, you might hear the word used, or someone who's traumatized. And I think it can be used to both describe a distressing event as well as the distress associated with the event. When we're thinking about it in a more clinical perspective, trauma is, there's a traumatic event, and certainly within the DSM-4 and the DSM-5, that traumatic event has certain characteristics, in particular that it's life-threatening or actually resulted in death, that it caused serious bodily harm, or there was a real threat of that, or it involved sexual violence or threats to bodily integrity. And it also considers what relationship that person had to that event, whether they were a direct victim, whether they were a witness of what happened, whether it was a close family member or friend who was victimized. And actually recently, just the DSM-5 has expanded it to include first responders, which I think is good thinking, in terms of who's exposed to these experiences. And so when we talk about trauma-informed, so when we think about trauma, I think we often can confuse event and reactions. And so that describes how you define a traumatic event. And then there's a series of, a set of traumatic reactions. And those reactions, again, as a mental health clinician referring to the DSM, essentially involve certain sorts of reactions that show that person was psychologically overwhelmed by that event. And I think that's one thing that different definitions have in common. And that psychological overwhelm looks different ways. So when we talk about being trauma-informed, we're talking about having services that are informed by that knowledge of what is trauma and what are traumatic reactions. And trauma-informed services, kind of a good parallel is thinking about in the health system. If you think about universal precautions for bloodborne pathogens in the health system, so one of the things about trauma-informed care is we're recognizing that in our services that most of us are involved in, especially in the public service field, we are interacting with trauma survivors much more often than we're identifying, much more often than we realize. And so then sometimes we're faced with our clients, people that we're trying to give good services to, presenting with certain behaviors or challenges that are confusing, unless we start looking at it through a trauma lens. And so when you start looking at certain things through a trauma lens, it starts to make more sense. And that's really helpful in terms of them actually doing the work. And so when you think about trauma-informed care, then again, using that analogy of the universal precautions, in the same way that in a hospital setting, it doesn't matter who walks through the door. If I'm going to draw your blood, I'm going to put on gloves, I'm going to use needle stick precautions, I'm going to use the sharps container. There's certain protocols for how I handle that needle afterwards. And I don't need to know whether or not, what your status is. I don't need to know whether you have a bloodborne pathogen illness. I'm going to treat everyone equally. And it's good care. It doesn't matter who it is, it's just good care. And so it's a similar approach that I think the mental health field is now coming to with trauma-informed services. The idea is that if we treat everyone as if they could have that history, and treat everyone as if that could not just be sort of an additional issue, but maybe a central issue in their coping, they're dealing with on a daily basis, that will actually raise the level of care for the whole system.
Yeah, I love that too. That's a great definition, and I'll bring it. I think in the work and the day-to-day stuff that not just that all our frontline staff do with clients. It really boils down to, I think, that just compassion and empathy, and trauma-informed care is a way to capture it. And now that this term is really being coined and pushed, I think it backs up and connects with the psychological, emotional, trauma of say depths of layer of trauma, what impact it'll have on clients. But then it's how do we approach it? I think one of the things that we push that's important is it's not we're not coming in contact with folks thinking, how can we fix this person? We're trying to just be a part of their life and figure things out and what got them to where they are at this moment. And so I do think that, from a personal perspective, I'll share this. This is not meant to be a critique, around systems, but I think it's a reality. People get burnt out in this field. And for me, at least, it's been a reflection of, as we continue to talk about trauma-informed care, where do I stand too? Can I still be that compassionate and empathetic person to everyone that comes, across, my path? And understandably, I can see, whether it's lawyers, police officers, medical providers, that sometimes you may see, a client that resembles the last 10, 15 clients. And maybe that wasn't the best outcome that came, but that doesn't mean the one in front of you is going to be the same way, right? And so it's been a compassion and empathy check for myself. And definitely like our staff, we continuously talk about new things, new research, new articles, anything that comes out on trauma-informed care, so we can stay really, checking ourselves about it. But again, it's I think an angle of how we go about our work. It's taking into consideration that many of our participants, the folks that we're serving, have trust issues beyond just the trauma, so they have trust issues, right? Their trauma, what they look to somebody, say a young man who, has marijuana issues and has a gun possession, they seem like, oh man, I won't mess with that person. But when you come to find out that, they're carrying a gun because they were victimized before. They can't walk or travel a certain pathway to their house. They got to do all kinds of things to get away because there's gangs after them. That, because of previous trauma, their way of coping, because the only medical provider that they had was the emergency room, guess what? They waiting in 3 hours, 4 hours just to get your Vicodin or something to deal with the pain that first trauma, inflicted upon you. I'd rather just go on the block and get me, joy and do something else to take care. And so I'm going to self-medicate in a different way. These things are, they may not come to mind right off the top of your head when you get a quick rundown, but trauma-informed care is pushing that to really look beyond just what you see in that snapshot. And so.
Definitely.
And so John and Carla, the organizations have produced the gold standard for trauma-informed care. Heather, you've done research around the criminal justice system and the way that victims experience being a part of that system and how perhaps the lack of trauma-informed care there might impact how they interact or choose to even engage with the criminal justice system. Can you talk about the implications of that?
Sure. Yeah, and I focused on in the intro that kind of first project that we did that launched all of these projects around victims' rights and services. I think the most recent one, this report, Untold Stories of California Crime Victims, Research and Recommendations on Repeat Victimization and Rebuilding Lives. This was really an attempt, as we further understood kind of where the gaps were. It's these repeat survivors of trauma who face the most barriers and who are clearly traumatized and have the sort of most complex basket of needs that aren't getting to the door, aren't getting to the front door of services. So I'll start with that. I think it's really overwhelming to look at some of the hard numbers, and then this report was an attempt to put color and texture through focus groups and long-form interviews and stories about what those numbers actually mean and why they are the way they are. Only, I believe the most recent stat out of the Department of Justice is that only 14% of survivors of crime get access to trauma recovery services, and that number plummets to 4% when they don't report crime. And we're looking at nearly 70% of survivors of violence have faced significant socio-emotional consequences. So again, when we talk about those critical points of access, that was the main finding of this report, is that focus groups throughout the state, over and over again, the bottom line is people just aren't getting access to trauma recovery services, which I think we have to take on as a threshold question before we look at, well, who is getting access to services, what are those services look like, and are they trauma informed? I mean, like the fact that we're not even connecting folks with anyone who might, and who might have or not have the requisite level of understanding. Again, having done interviews with hundreds of service providers, I can say again that these two are the absolute gold standard, and it's amazing and just such an honor and such an inspiration that Youth Alive and TRCs exist, but we're really facing an issue that they are the total outliers through the state of California. Because again, in the vast majority of counties, when it comes to trauma-informed services that can really meet a host of complicated needs that victims have in the aftermath of crime, in many places, those state-based centers might be one of the only options, and might be the ones who have awareness of what other referrals need to happen if there's really a dearth of those options in some counties. And as was alluded to already, a lot of those services are focused on navigating the justice process, and there's kind of an unintentional hierarchy that happens when they are so strapped and so triaging that if you're not cooperating with law enforcement and you don't have a case going forward and you don't have sort of another role to play within the criminal justice system, are you going to get that same response and that same level of contact that the victim who might be a witness, in a case going forward would get? And I think it's really an issue also from a trauma-informed perspective, that what we found in report after report, project after project, it's really the depth of care and the continuity of care that victims often need from a trauma-informed perspective to make a difference. And when you have such under-resourced, especially to the justice system base that might not have that requisite level of trauma training, that might be operating within a criminal justice system that is very dichotomized and looks at who victims and our perpetrators are and the role that they have or don't have to play in a dignified criminal justice process, that you're really talking about a very shallow level of care and a few kind of basic needs that may or may not be relevant to what that victim who's in front of you on that day is facing. And again, with this report that really looked at all of these issues from the idea of repeat survivors of violence, another kind of term du jour with trauma-informed is poly-victimization, which some of you may have heard of. If we're starting to, the research and the broad understanding, I think that's crossing over both the mental health field and also the public safety field, is that when victimization isn't an isolated event, that for so many victims of crime, of all types of crimes, it's compounded with prior experience of community violence, that PTSD, we can't call it P, if the traumatic stress disorder is ongoing and you're getting re-traumatized all the time. Such an incredible percentage of the participants of these focus groups for the latest report on repeat victimization, again, they were recruited because they were repeat survivors of various types of violence, but nearly every single female participant, again, this wasn't why she was there, but it came out in the course of the discussions, was also a survivor of child sexual abuse, commercial sexual exploitation, and or rape. And what the impact and the reverberating consequences that had when she was again interacting with justice system-based stakeholders who don't have trauma-informed training, or wasn't getting the access to the counseling she needed to even be able to go there and engage on some of these issues. So again, I could go on and on with the sort of ripple effects of the way that this played out, but the last thing I'll say right now on this piece is that it was really fascinating what a tremendous percentage of the participants never got access to trauma-informed services at the time, right immediately following certain violent and traumatic events, but the only services that they may have accessed sometimes were years down the road, sometimes a decade or more, that they'd actually connected up with through substance abuse counseling. That what we have was when we don't have these interventions in close proximity with the trauma and help people get their feet back under them and deal with just some of these, basic needs, like that housing, just feeling safe, getting your sense of security and self back, that in the consequence of that, it's not that people just go without, they have alternate routes of trying to deal, and the self-medicating and the amount of people that had dropped out of school or turned to substances, which led to a host of problems for themselves and the dependents they cared for, who may have now further criminal and juvenile justice system contacts because of their role of substances. Maybe a decade later, that's when I got trauma services and counseling and started dealing with the stuff that happened way back when. So again, we're trying to build bridges with our public safety policies and understanding what prevention looks like and what victims of crime's needs are, and it's not about the right here and now, it's about this ecosystem of what happens to survivors of crime when we don't do right by them with these trauma-informed approaches. We have much deeper problems to deal with.
John, a lot of Youth Lives work with victims focuses on something that I think a lot of people would traditionally think of as a victim's need, which is violence prevention. Can you talk a little bit, can you talk about that and also just the significance of, I guess, the overlap between, people who are victims of crime and then who feel the need to, protect themselves and then fall on the other side of crime?
Yeah. Morgan and I were actually talking about this a little bit earlier. There's a very thin line oftentimes between victim and perpetrator. And as I mentioned, kind of my example. Yes, when you're fearing for your life, you may pick up a gun. You may find ways that you can protect yourself. It's part of the resiliency, I think, of what these underserved communities really have to face on a day-to-day basis. Young men, it's the only, I wouldn't say just guns, but there's knives and whatnot. But they feel like that's the way that they're going to be the only effective way to deal with any flight kind of incidences that they face. And so part of our intervention, and again we were talking about this earlier, is that violence prevention for us is about breaking the cycle. Part of breaking that cycle though is giving tools around healing. It's not just, okay, one of the main things that we try to do is at that time, that critical incident, is look, assess, are there family members, are there friends that are really, animated and they're looking for retaliation. So we're going to focus on that, absolutely. But then, breaking that cycle isn't just deterring that and kind of, trying to deal with it in just that one snapshot. It's really building the resiliency again for young men and women that have been victims, right? So one of our agency values is healing. We promote that and we push it. We actually have expanded our program, the one I mentioned that does our hospital-based work. First was doing just that wraparound kind of services and the case management kind of interventions. About 2 years ago, we were able to get some seed funding, and now we're continuously expanding on it, but we have now mental health services internally in our agency. We used to have good providers that we could refer to, but the way that Youth Alive has its flavor in working with folks is really about, again, caring and taking someone's life and trying to wrap ourselves around it. So our mental health therapists will go out with our intervention specialists and have these sessions, mental health sessions in folks' homes, right? We're trying to really meet folks where they are at because, again, it's about building, I think, a relationship. It's building trust. And for some folks, they are very insular to their community. They can't see beyond that. There's kids that we just take them, on the other side of town. Oh my, this is a part of the city. Yeah, man, it's the same place. And so again, people are very limited, I think, in what they view as their world. So being able to provide that kind of service and taking it to their homes is key. Now, we also take into consideration that that very home may be, a source of all the trauma and providing, some of the tension. So absolutely, as clients may build a relationship with us, we're like, okay, is this the best place? We can take you back to the office. We'll come pick you up. But even just the transportation, is a big piece to them delivering those services, right? But, you know, again, we'll do whatever it takes. The main goal is, how do we provide that service? How do we get you guys talking about, you know, your mental health, giving you tools, you know, with all our young folks that we work with. We do things like, we'll set up a safety plan for them. We're looking at things that they can use, you know, kind of when they're in that moment of stress, of trauma, and it's re-triggering. What can you do? Breathing exercises, you know, things with tactile, you know, objects. You know, it could be that they just have a song that they refer to, or a picture of, you know, some loved one. All of these things, you know, in developing their safety plan, their individualized safety plan is catered so that when they are faced with those incidences of trauma, that they have a resource to kind of, you know, go to. You know, sometimes they forget, but the point being there is having that constant reminder of working with folks and building that resiliency. Then oftentimes we feel, yes, it will detract from the retaliation or just the reaction of, you know, maybe being faced with someone's trying to fight with me, or they may choose the option of de-stressing, getting out of the situation, and finding a better way to deal with things. And so this is all kind of in that violence prevention model and breaking that cycle. But again, by building folks, we feel it prevents further exposure to the trauma.
So going off of your work, which is really recognizing the way that violence can pervade or cycle through communities, I think that is an interesting segue into talking about the Victims Compensation Program, which is a state-run program that can provide financial aid to victims of crime. This is a general synopsis. Maybe starting with John and Carla, can you talk about what it's like for your clients to apply to this program, and maybe some of the barriers for certain individuals and communities in accessing these resources that are intended for them?
Okay. Definitely get your information. I love everything about your program. And so, with the Victim of Crime program, so interestingly, the Trauma Recovery Center actually was started because it was a pilot program seeded by money from the Victim of Crime program. And so it's just been interesting over the years. That ended after about 3 years, and we've gotten funding from other places, but now we're kind of back getting funds through them. But it's interesting because when we're talking about trauma-informed care, unfortunately, that state agency is really so far from trauma-informed care in terms of what they're providing. And in so many ways, it really operates primarily like an insurance agency, to be honest. It's claims-based, and it most resembles an insurance agency in the way in which it operates, in the sense that first of all, it's very hard to, a lot of survivors don't even know it exists. Often we're the first people letting survivors know about it. And once survivors do know that it exists, as Heather has said, as John has said, there's an expectation. It's out of the criminal justice system and it's connected to that. And it's really geared to increase cooperation with law enforcement, really. I don't know if that's what they would consider, if that's how they would describe themselves, but there's a clear distinction between those people who cooperate with law enforcement to their satisfaction and those who do not cooperate with law enforcement. That's sort of the first cutoff. So if you make your way to the agency, did you file a police report? Are you in communication with law enforcement? If you're not, pretty much that's the first denial. And are you the right kind of victim? That could be another denial. If you have any, if you're currently on parole or probation, even if you're a victim of a crime that has absolutely no relationship to that, then you're not going to be receiving those funds. If you are a victim of drug-facilitated sexual assault, where you, because of a substance that was induced, you have no memory of good parts of the assault except waking up in an alley with no underwear and no pants, and having pain. There are no witnesses, and so there's a very good chance that that's not going to be accepted. And if you feel too much shame to to file a police report because of that, or to return the call of an investigator, then that can become a reason to not get services. And so, again, when we're talking about trauma-informed care, it's a system that very much does not operate as if it understands the reasons why, the reactions and behaviors of someone who has recently been a victim of a crime. The other thing that's very difficult is even for those survivors who cooperate with law enforcement, who are considered to be kind of the right kind of victim, the processing times for that application are very long. So even in the best case scenario, the initial phase takes 2 to 3 months. If you have lost your job, if you can't get out of bed, if you have kids, if you are severely depressed and scared to go outside your door because of safety concerns, 2 to 3 months is forever. And so it's, and that's for the first, and that's if things are going well. That's the first barrier, the first level. And then the whole process often takes much, quite a bit longer than that. Even in the best case scenario, I think I've seen it take maybe 4 months, 5 months for someone to go smoothly through the process to the point of being, to getting an approval. And so, luckily at our agency, there are services where people are not waiting to be reimbursed by that service. If we were, we wouldn't be serving anyone, because, the minute we're starting services often within hours of someone being victimized. Because the truth is that experience is immediately disorganizing to every single part of your life. And the idea of having to find that form, fill out that form, submit it, and then follow up as you really have to keep on top of people. It's really illogical. It's really not set up in a way that allows victims to really access it or use it.
I can give one brief example if that's helpful of sort of what the problem is on that vein. We worked with a mother whose son was murdered like 200 feet from their home in East Palo Alto. And the same week that the son was murdered, she went out and had a community car wash to raise money for her son's funeral because she wanted a big traditional Catholic funeral. She ended up getting, I think, $2,000 or something from the car wash. But that obviously isn't enough to pay for a big funeral, or really any type of funeral. So the state has this program where you can get an emergency award for funeral burial expenses for up to $5,000 now. And you're supposed to be able to get that within 30 days so that you can sort of pay the funeral home and just, get that whole process going because it's time limited, obviously. But the local victim witness office told her that because she held the car wash, she was not entitled to receive any additional funds, sort of treating it like an insurance claim in terms of getting a windfall for doing 2 types of payment. So because she didn't get that funding, she ended up having to cremate her son, which she hadn't wanted to do. And, basically the sole reason for that was because she didn't get this money. So it's a big problem.
Sorry, we only have 5 minutes left, Natasha. This is Progressive Lawyering Conference. I'd really like to hear you talk about criminal justice projects. We haven't touched on that yet. Can we talk about how that started? I guess a way to put it is are victims' rights taught in law school? How did you find out about this? What changes do you think this could make?
I definitely think that probably most law schools there's more of a defendant focus, and I think that's really important when there's a law system to do to treat defendants more fairly. But I guess I think it would be helpful if there were also more of a focus, or really any focus on what victims go through in terms of crime. If any of the law students out here are interested in training, please get in touch with me. But yeah, it's really, I think especially I'm interested in being a DA and just learning about all the victims' issues, I think, will make me a better lawyer. I think that it's an important part of the law school system.
Sorry, I know you're going to talk about VCP, which we could all go on for a lifetime, but could you talk about maybe also the people you work with, and maybe you work as well with too, their experiences with lawyers
I think in Alameda County, it's a little bit different, you know, because I think, to give them credit, right, they do work in partnership, and like, the folks that we work with, when filling out those VOC applications, they would say, you know, I'm really doing a fundraiser, just don't bring it up, don't anything, and they would actually still push the 5,000. So it's been a partnership where, you know, I would say they're maybe trauma-informed, but they definitely have another level of compassion and have worked with us in many cases. I think, you know, and this goes, I think, to the whole system, kind of back to the part about connecting with lawyers. You know, there is that whole criminal justice system. One thing that wasn't mentioned, that the law enforcement side really plays a big role, right? And I think even when reports are made, a real quick example, we had a young man who was shot. He ended up losing his eye. For the first week and a half to 2 weeks, he was in the hospital, drugged up, and did not remember any conversations that happened, and he was really, you know, lost. Well, an officer came the day or the day after to try to take a report. Obviously, this kid couldn't, you know, really answer your questions in any coherent way, but wrote up the report saying that he was uncooperative. How can you cooperate if you're not in your right mind, in your senses of anything? How do you write that up and then that be the reason why it was initially denied? Most folks would probably leave it at that. Oh, it's not for us. What we did is we advocated. We, you know, wrote up letters. We supported it with our in-house mental health clinician to talk about what that period was when the first report was made, and say there was no way that you guys can say he was uncooperative. You know, he may not still know things or whatnot, but to make that claim, and successfully, you know, it was then on appeal approved. But that's the kind of stuff that I think, you know, that folks may be conscious of, and I think when it comes to, you know, attorneys, there's already many steps that they've been in, you know, gone through already, where again those trust issues, you know, or the untrust is there, and so kind of going back to trauma-informed care is, I think that there is a role where attorneys can come from an angle of like, did folks inform you about this stuff? You know, we have these services, these things are there, you know, and somewhat being an advocate, you know, taking into consideration whatever this particular case holds in front of you, but making aware, you know, and if they have been a part of the program, then great, you know, that's already a step in that direction. But it's that reinforcement that it's still about their care and empathy and treating them as such. So that's fine.
Yeah, just to kind of also weigh in on what lawyers and young lawyers who want to get involved in these issues and what the role of reform around some of these issues looks like, also not just in a direct advocacy sense, but so much, and I think this was thematic through all of these comments, and we could all go on. I mean, dozens of we recently did a statewide evaluation on the victim compensation program, and dozens of interviews, story after story, where something didn't add up because the face of the regulation, something got tripped up where a victim was able to get rubber stamped as not the right type of victim for whatever reason. Were they uncooperative? And when you actually look behind the curtain at the much more complicated situation of the traumatic events, the circumstances of the crime, the victim's needs, it's just, that's what trauma looks like. It's a much more complicated picture than a paper-pushing form and insurance context. And so I think, you know, the role of not just advocacy, like is that theme over and over again, if you don't have, especially in the aftermath of trauma, if you don't have the advocacy and support behind you, that your needs just aren't going to get met because you're not in a state necessarily to step up and navigate these challenges on your own. But also thinking about the reform that's necessary in our policies. I think so much of victims' rights and services, not just in the victim compensation program, but the fact that all these state-based programs exist within the justice system, even though we know that's not a realistic way for many communities and survivors to connect with. So much of it is a product of the tough on crime, very punitive 90s that created this false dichotomy between victims and offenders. And I think even the way we think about it in law school, you know, programs for defendants versus programs for victims, I think the trauma-informed, policy idea is that dichotomy does not exist. That so often, this is when you refocus it through a community health lens and a prevention lens and what actually keeps us safe and what actually helps victims of crime rebuild their lives and their communities, everything looks really different. And so again, the victim compensation program is such a poignant example because some of you may have been following in the news, and even this past year, there was a huge victory a few months ago where one of the victims of crime program regulations was changed to no longer discriminate against sex workers for having, they can't get stamped anymore as you contributed to your own victimization just by the nature of the environment in which you were victimized. And everyone championed that as a really great step forward, and it was. But the problem is, if we keep tinkering around the edges with this policy fix, or this advocacy push, what we're missing is that the inconsistencies in how we see and understand victims and those judgments that come into play with poverty and some of these other social justice issues about who's a deserving victim versus who's not, we're going to keep having to wage those battles one by one. Really, what we're looking at and what we need from the victim compensation program perspective and for how we think about and situate victim services all the way from within the criminal justice system to how we talk about it and learn about it in law schools, is that we need a philosophical and programmatic shift that starts seeing and understanding trauma more realistically.
So is 2 o'clock ended with one question or is that other?
Yeah, we have one question, but then really sort of have to wrap that up the next time.
Right. Okay, I'll try to make this super quick. So I'm a district attorney. I've recently finished a stint in juvenile, and listening to you guys talk, 2 questions that have actually plagued me the whole time I was in juvie keep coming up, and I'm wondering what suggestions, given your backgrounds and your expertise, you have. The first is I think juvie is a unique, little lens where you much more quickly and easily see how permeable that wall between victim and perpetrator is, because you don't have to wait till someone turns 18. And the second is because minors who are in the juvenile system come in with their family, you're also aware of the community health aspect. I'm wondering, the 2 problems I've seen that I'd love to get your feedback on are the following. The first is that we'll have a minor come in who's very young and who's perpetrated, a pretty atrocious sexual crime on someone else. And he may come in with his younger brother in the audience and his parents. And there's no discussion, and I understand that from my perspective as a district attorney and his attorney's perspective as a public defender, it's not our role to discuss who may have perpetrated the crime on the minor, and most importantly, from a perspective of community health, whether that person, whether the source is still involved in the lives of the other people who are with us in that courtroom. And the second, it kind of related, and John, you touched on this, is what services, what therapies, what support do you think is ideal for the victim, particularly the victim of a crime that we know has very high likelihood of spitting out into other, substance abuse, perpetrator, however you want to label it, issues. To do whatever we can to put a roadblock in that very unfortunately likely path somebody may already be on.
Well, I think that's a great point, that's a great example, and one thing, definitely there needs to be more coordination and everyone on the same level, because it is kind of it's a barrier that other systems wouldn't get triggered, or that you wouldn't be able to investigate, or you wouldn't be able to feel that there's other avenues. I do think mental health is one way, but I just recently heard too in some of the work that we've done in training other programs in other states, as an example, that their CPS, like a gunshot, a youth who gets shot, comes to the hospital, and automatically they've worked it and have this level of coordination where, because of negligence, or I forgot what the specific term was, but because of youth negligence, they are on hold for at least 24 to 48 hours in the hospital, while other programs can then come in and try to, kind of work around them and stuff. And definitely, I think there's a point of entry that you're talking about there, and that's what we, I think in trauma-informed care, we're always looking, where were the point of entries where we could have done something, and you're pointing out a place where it could be. I think knowing some of the mental health resources, some of the other programs, maybe intervention stuff, because our program is so focused on kind of that community violence and gunshot. Like I'd probably have to investigate even in Alameda to figure out who may work with more of a sexual, crime nature. But it would be good, I think, to kind of have a whole host of those services out there so that those people can get referred to or even maybe mandated, by judges that they need to have mental health services, that they need to work with intervention programs, they need to do all this stuff. And this is where I think that cooperation and coordination with multiple systems would benefit a case like that.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you, John. It so happens that for 6 years before being at the Trauma Recovery Center, I was a therapist at juvenile hall and with at Log Cabin Ranch and with that part of the gig. And so at that time, we were part, and again, a lot of these programs are pilot programs, grant funded, don't have longevity, unfortunately. But at the time, the program that I was a part of was called Family Integrated Treatment Services out of San Francisco Juvenile Hall and Juvenile Probation. And it was specifically for cases like this, where when there was a suspicion that there was multi-system involvement or the potential for that for a young person coming in for a crime, and there was a flag there that, what else is going on here. There was an interdisciplinary team meeting, and there was a forum to talk about that and to really look at what point of intervention, this is a point of intervention, but what are we looking at? We at the time had community partners as well as therapists working out of juvenile probation. Also at YGC, we had a relationship with the schools and obviously probation, and in developing a coordinated approach. Having not been in that system for a while, I have no idea what still exists. And part of the problem is that resources are often patchy. They're often, they don't have longevity because somebody has a great idea and then the funding disappears. But I think in a situation like that, special programs for youth who does the mental health support in juvenile hall and juvenile probation, that would definitely warrant a consult with them. And have the mental health professional then step in as the mental health professional, separate from your role. But to then be able to do some assessment with that young person who's an offender, but very clearly a victim as well of trauma, and do some more assessment around what kind of interventions could there be for that person. Is this something where someone needs to do a CPS report on behalf of that child who has now been victimized to somebody else? But you're right, I mean, these things come up all the time where it's obvious that there's a lot more going on under the surface. And I think what you said, John, about integration and collaboration is key. The power of that collaborative when we had it was that we could each approach things from our perspectives, from these different systems. And one of the things that was amazing about it is that for each youth who was flagged for our services, we could look at their history in each system within the city, within the county mental health system, within the school system, within the juvenile justice system, and look at what's happening here. We're noticing some patterns, what's happening here. But that, again, it can be really hard to get that level of collaboration, which would be the best case scenario.
So thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much